Roll up. Test. We can get a seat. We can start pretty soon. We're going to grab a drink and. Have yourself going to grab a drink and have a seat. We get started here. I know. Yeah. Here we go. How y'all doing? I'm Bill Moore, the Tallahassee Markets President here in Tallahassee. I appreciate y'all coming tonight. Hopefully we're all going to learn something. I do want to give a little shout out to the Tallahassee and Thomasville teams here. They really helped put this together, make the phone calls, get everybody here. We also have advisory board members from Thomasville and Tallahassee as well. Appreciate them here, and you're probably going to learn a little bit more about some work that we asked them to do tonight. Also, Mr. Turner's in the back. Appreciate you as well, market exec in Thomasville and US 19 corridor. So thank you all. Appreciate y'all being here. We're lucky to have Cal Evans. It's my honor to introduce him. He's our Senior Director of Market Intelligence and Analytics at Synovus. Since joining Synovus in 2008, which, as I said, was a fun year to join. Cal has been instrumental in guiding our bank's strategic insights into commercial real estate and economic trend. He chairs as a Synovus Economic Advisory Council, advises Atlanta Federal Reserve. He also gives his expertise as faculty member for the LSU Graduate School of Banking and the University of Georgia, which I gotta say, he went to University of Georgia as well, an MBA, and I've told a few people I do this, but you know, when we clap, they clap like this now. Some people will catch that. Gotta say that in a similar way. Anyway, with decades of experience, he always understands our markets and economic forces to shape our communities. And with no further ado, please give a Tallahassee warm welcome to Cal.
So look around at your bankers. I want to tell you, I know I'm a day early for Halloween. I've got my costume on. I'm going as a 90s banker. I'm the only one with a tie. All right, there's a QR code. I've been told by the marketing department to tell you this. There's a QR code on your table. You can download the presentation that we're about to show with that. So I encourage you to take it home. If you can't sleep tonight, just pull it up and review it again. Thanks, Ty and Bill, for having me to the market. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to doing this. Love coming down and talking to clients and hearing their stories and giving you sort of a little bit of insight about what we're seeing in the markets. I'll tell you that I can't recall a year with more fundamental structural changes to track than this year. Not 2008 with the GFC. That was fairly simple in terms of what happened. We got a little too loose financially. Not 2020 with COVID. That was medical, so that was a little bit easier to understand. We've just seen a pattern of really paradigm-shifting systemic shocks that really may or may not stick depending on which court is hearing the argument that day. It's kind of crazy. Also can't recall an economy where we've had more variation in sentiment. There are countless numbers of opinions. There are thousands of shades of gray. It's really hard to distill customer sentiment into actionable takeaway, but I'm going to try to do that tonight. And I'm going to walk you through two forms of proprietary analytics that we have that do distill our commercial client opinions down and offer you some insights into what we're seeing in the markets. Now, when we hear the word analytics, we tend to talk about big data centers and AI. That's basically all you hear about on Bloomberg these days. But we have a little bit more realistic, functional view of analytics. We have old school analytics where we do the revolutionary act of asking our clients what they think and what they're seeing. Amazing that you might do that these days. But we also have big data analytics where we look at about 25 million data points from our commercial clients each month and look at how their industries are performing, so we've got like a real-time read of how everybody's working along, and we can compare that to the client survey to get a read on what's happening. And that's what I'm going to present tonight. And I'm going to start with the survey, and I'll tell you how it works. It's essentially what we call a PMI survey, or a Purchase Managers Index survey. And what it does is it asks three main questions. It asks about business activity right now compared to the previous quarter, and also what we think is coming a year from now. It asks about margin trends, so how much are your input costs going up or going down, and what are you able to sell your products for. We also ask about employment levels, so how does that look relative to last quarter, and how does it look a year from now. That's a traditional PMI survey. We added 3 bonus questions this year as we saw the new administration come in, and we've asked our customers how they're being impacted by government policies, how they're being impacted by trade policies, and whether or not they're using artificial intelligence and the degree to which it's helping them. So I think this will be interesting for you to hear this. We did this survey over a 3-week window. It's really fresh. We did it from September 16th to October 5th. The timing of this allows us to get a really good insight to the commercial client before our CEO, Kevin Blair, has to talk to the investors and the analysts after earnings. So this gives some insight into that. When you break down this group, it's about 75% small business, it's about 20% middle market, and it's about 5% large corporate business. So mainly focusing on Main Street to some degree here. We had about 400 responses in this survey. Now I want to start with current business activity. And what we do, you can look on these screens that we've got, we give our respondents 3 options. They're talking about comparing current activity to the previous quarter. They can say lower, they can say same, or they can say the higher. And what's interesting is over the past 2 quarters, there's almost no variation at all in the business activity levels. And a lot of that has to do with the lack of clarity or the opacity in the market that's making people sit while they figure out exactly what's coming or what's going on. We're going to dig into that a little bit. Now, I don't really care about what's going on now, because our job is to look at what's coming in the future. And that's where the PMI survey works, to look at consumer sentiment going forward. And what we see is that our commercial clients are extremely optimistic. You'll see that the majority of the respondents have said that they expect higher business a year from now than they have right now. And when I looked at these results, I had 4 quarters of 41, 41, 41, 42%. And I thought that must be mathematically impossible. How's that working? And I saw I looked at my analyst team and I saw that the one from Georgia did that. So I immediately asked our Georgia Tech analyst to check the work, and she did. and it's correct. So I can tell you that those are correct numbers. Now what's interesting about that is that when I saw that, I thought, there's no way that the level of optimism was constant from the 4th quarter of 24 to now. There's been too much variation in the economy. And it made me think, if we're asking somebody in the 4th quarter of 24, think about this, it's mainly small business. They reacted extremely well to the Trump election. Optimism should have been through the roof. But there have been some challenges over the past few quarters with some policy changes, and I would have expected that to come down. So maybe the bar of how current activity relative to a year from now, maybe that's dropping. That was my hypothesis. But what turned out when we asked our clients this quarter, because I wanted to address that question, we were dead wrong with that thought. Our clients are truly optimistic. We had 40% that said they expect higher business, 40% said the same, comparing this past quarter to the fourth quarter 24. So for the most part, they feel good. Now you've got some that feel worse, but for the most part, we've got good optimism there in the portfolio. Now, when we're looking at the business activity, we do ask these bonus questions. And if anything is affecting business activity very clearly, it would be the policy pieces that we've got from executive orders and new legislation. And when we ask our clients what degree of impact do we had 50% say moderate to substantial, 30% said minor impact. But let me dig into that a little bit further. When we ask them to rate the level of impact to this government policy and executive action, what we saw is that the no impact dropped a little bit, the minor impact dropped a pretty good bit, but the moderate impact popped up, and it's been on a 3-quarter escalation run that's pretty significant. And what that's telling me is that there's more clarity in the market related to executive actions and government policy. And why is that? Because for the most part, those things are immediate. We're seeing those actions take place in the news. They're hitting our businesses, positive or negative. That's what we're reacting to. So it's clear to me that our clients see that and they know that there's a little bit more clarity on that piece than trade, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Now, when we look into this business activity and we ask our clients, what is affecting you, you get some interesting answers. You get pros and cons. And what you're going to see, the cons outweigh the pros here. And I'm going to give you a little bit of some knowledge that we got from the Federal Reserve. We work with their national survey team. And what you're going to hear is that people who are being negatively affected are more likely to tell you about that in their narrative responses. If everything's going good, they're just going to check the box and move on. So don't see a preponderance of cons and think everybody's not happy. You know, plenty of them are happy. You see the optimism rolling just fine. And so this is what the cons are. This is what are affecting our commercial clients. First off would be subsidy and grant cuts. And, you know, that particularly affects our philanthropies in our footprint. It affects other areas that are highly dependent on grants, medical groups, things like that. Departmental downsizing was another one that our clients mentioned. And specifically, our clients said they were worried about the IRS being downsized. Now, I read that and I thought, that's a bonus. They might not audit me this year. You know, that's good. But think about this. This is mainly CPAs, mainly lawyers, and mainly small business, and they're all involved in active actions with the IRS. And if they downsize them, it's going to take another year or two to work through. So they're really, really worried about that. I thought that may have been idiosyncratic to us, but it's not. The National Federation of Independent Businesses did the exact same survey, and 30% of their respondents said the IRS was their #1 issue. So interesting that that's out there. Lower government spending certainly matters here, and I'm not just talking about at the federal level, because what we're hearing is that those federal funds that go down to the state level, and those state level funds that trickle down to the lower level, and everybody that has contract and sales relationships with those entities, they're worried about whether their sales are actually going to materialize. So that's something that people are worried about. Medicaid cuts and lower reimbursements, mainly related to the Big Beautiful Bill. I do want to point out that the media coverage on the Big Beautiful Bill, I don't particularly think is fair. The way that it's written, and I try to be real apolitical and balanced in this thing, but the way that it's written, it makes it sound like this legislation just knocks people off the rolls. It doesn't. What it does is it makes the enforcement procedures more draconian and the hurdles a little bit harder to hit. But if you meet those hurdles, you can stay on the rolls. So just to make that clear, I think that's an issue. But where would we hear this from the most? It would be physicians. It would be hospital groups, particularly in rural areas, and also home health care providers to seniors. We're hearing that a lot. And lastly, labor shortages. That's a big one. That has particularly been an issue in South Florida, where we're hearing about our clients having ICE raids. I just talked to someone who spoke about a business in Pensacola who was shut down because their employees were taken away, that kind of thing. And it creates a fear environment where people are unwilling to enter the labor pool in certain markets, and that is causing some shortages. Now, on the pro side, you've got something that's a little bit more nebulous. First would be correct wasteful spending. That's one that was thrown out there a lot. And I think that everybody is all for correcting wasteful spending. It's just what's your definition of wasteful spending? That's what people can't agree on. So I think that is something that we are getting a little bit better at doing. The creating efficient economy, that's pretty vague, but I think what they really mean is creating a more fair economy. And whatever your interpretation of fair trade policy is, that seems to be what's driving this. And then deregulation spurs growth. Well, that's certainly true. Whether you're looking at mergers and acquisitions, and Synovus is certainly a great example of that, we've certainly felt it, that is doing a lot for our clients because their regulatory burdens are being reduced and their taxes are staying low. So these are positives that a lot of our commercial clients are citing as basically good things that come out of this government policy movement. All right, so let's move to margin trends. Now, to me, this is the most interesting part of the three questions that we're asking. And margin really isn't a great story. I think when we think about inflation and we see a number that's generally been between 2 and 3%, it's currently at 3%, that's cash register inflation for the most part. We go to the store, that's what we see. But when we're talking about our commercial clients, we're thinking about supply chains and what do we see from our suppliers? What do we see from our labor sources? What do we see from our foreign input providers? And unfortunately, we're on a 2-quarter run where we're seeing almost 50% of our clients are saying their costs are going up. That would surprise the average Joe off the street, but that doesn't surprise anybody in this room, I'm sure. What's unfortunate is that this ended about a 6-quarter run of a declining trend in people that said that their input costs were going up. Now, there are a few reasons for this. The knee-jerk reaction is to say that tariffs caused this. Let me tell you this, that is not the issue here. What we hear most from our clients is that preemptive pricing in anticipation of tariffs is what has caused a lot of this piece. So I'm going to tell you, tariff impacts really aren't here yet. Some of you may be seeing them, but they are going to hit the most in the back end of this year and the first half of 26, because we're still mainly moving front-loaded inventory that was bought without tariffs. And once we burn through that, then you'll see that escalate a little bit. Our CFO, Jamie Gregory, met with Dr. Raphael Bostic at the Atlanta Fed and another group of CFOs, and he said he was hearing the same thing from the freight people that were at that meeting, where they were basically saying that most of what they were moving was front-end loaded and it was not what would be tariffs. So we've seen confirmation there at the highest level. So let's think about these input prices. I'm on the road a lot, I'm in my car, I've either got Bloomberg or College Sports on, depending on who's talking or what team they're discussing. And when I'm on Bloomberg, what you always hear is some talking head will say, well, costs are going up, and they'll just pass that along to the consumer, right? Well, no, that's absolutely wrong. When we ask our clients if they can raise their prices to compensate for some of these input costs going up, only 1/5 of them say that they can. And it's basically stuck around 20% for the last year, and it really hadn't got that much better. So, I mean, our clients want to raise prices. Some of them need to raise prices. And what we're seeing pretty clearly in the narrative responses, and for those of you who are our advisory board members, thank you for participating in our recent survey. This is something that we've really heard from them lately. But when you look at those price changes that are out there, you've really got to consider that what our clients are trying to do now is project value and maintain volume. It's almost like they'll sacrifice margin to keep the doors open and the wheels spinning until there's some relief. So we are seeing a shift in there, especially in restaurants. And I'll get to that in just a little bit. So let's talk about the second bonus question, because when we're talking about margins, tariffs are certainly an issue. And when we ask our clients, are they seeing any impacts from trade policy, we've got about 80% that say that they are. But let's dig into how that's deconstructed, kind of like what we did with government policy. What you'll see is that there's not much change at all from whether it's no impact, minor impact, moderate impact, or substantial impact. There's not a whole bunch of movement, because going back to the surveys that we do with our commercial clients and with our advisory board members, what we hear is people aren't clear on what's going on with tariffs, so they're holding still until they get a little bit clearer picture. We got a little bit more clarity on that yesterday with China, which is good to hear. But still, when you think about a lot of our trade arrangements, They're still in flux. Some of them hadn't been signed. We're not sure about what the levels of foreign investment are. They're still shifting. So people are waiting for clarity on that. And it really lets you know exactly how much trade policy is nuanced. There's such a broad range of opinions on this when we ask people how tariffs affect them. And I'll show you a few examples. I'm going to start with a negative example just to get the bad one out of the way. So we've got a client, these are all real clients of ours that we've met as we've traveled around the footprint doing this. There's a client who sells patio furniture that he imports from Vietnam. When Liberation Day happened and they published the tariff list, he was going to get hit at 41%. He's happy because we do have an arrangement with Vietnam now that brought it down to 20%, but happy is with an asterisk because he's only happy that it's not twice that much. He's still paying an additional 20%. But think about what he's selling. He's selling patio furniture. What's that highly correlated with? New housing sales. So not only is he getting hit on the input costs, but he's selling into a low demand environment. Now, I'm going to tell you, I've lived in my house for a pretty long time, and my patio furniture looks absolutely horrible. I actually brought this up at one of our board members, and Kevin Blair, our CEO, looked at me, and he goes, look, we pay you too much money to have bad patio furniture. He's like, how bad are you talking about? And I said, well, Blair, I've got a chair that's black, white, and green. And he said, I don't believe that. And I said, okay, fine. I'll start putting it in my presentations. Here it is. I think everybody's got one of these. They've spray painted it over the years. It belonged to your grandmother or whatever. My wife loathes the slide, by the way. She's a fine woman with a great decorative touch, but I actually like this chair and kind of keep it around. But I digress. Let me get back into the tariff piece. I'll give you another example that's not in the deck, but it actually just came up at a lunch that I attended this week. I was talking to somebody that sells a household appliance. It's extremely common. It also goes out on the porch. I can't say exactly what it is. And they moved a lot of inventory when people were front-end loading from tariffs. And what they expected was as that inventory was sold off, that they would see the orders come back in and backfill them. But they're not seeing those orders at all. They have no backfill because the good that they're selling is not only a discretionary consumer item, but it's made out of metals that are stacking on an additional 25% tariff, and it's generally made in China or Vietnam. So they don't have investors who are willing to buy into that to support them if they're not getting any orders. And that's another example of where you're seeing some pressure in this. But let's talk about a good example. Going to Tuscaloosa, Alabama. We have a client that basically has a mining company where she's pulling tariff-free minerals out of the ground, and she is selling this to domestic producers, so that's great for her, no tariffs in the chain. But her competition basically are imported metals that are being tariffed. So she loves tariffs. They couldn't get put in fast enough, and they're not high enough. Because think about what she's seeing there. If her competition is foreign, she's going to be able to raise her prices to just below where the foreign groups are. And not only is she going to make more money, but she's going to increase her market share. She loves it. And I don't blame her. I mean, that isn't really great for me if I'm buying something that's produced from that chain. But this is America and it's capitalism. Great. She's winning. So that's a positive example of tariffs. Another one that we ran into in Brunswick, Georgia. This was a man who came up to me and he said, I'm kind of caught in a quandary. And I said, what is this? Now, let me tell you, this was back just after Liberation Day. Trump was threatening 50% tariffs on the EU. And he said, I make a machine that's entirely produced domestically, except for 2 parts, and they're made in Germany. He said, they're the most expensive part of my machine, and if I have to pay a 50% tariff on those 2 parts, it's going to make my machine unprofitable. So let me tell you what I think. If I can't get an exception for that, I'm against tariffs, or I'll stop making that product. If I can get an exception for that, then I'm all for it. Put them on. And he said, and I think I deserve an exception because they want us to buy domestically from domestic manufacturers. And he looked at me and said, guess what? That part hadn't been made in America since 1978. That's not fair. And he's up against the gun. So should he have to pay those tariffs? We don't know. I imagine that the line for an exception is longer than the Great Wall of China. And no pun or whatever intended with China being involved in that equation. And I'll give you sort of a random one. This is interesting to me. You really wouldn't think of a retail store as benefiting from a tariff. Let me give you an example of one that is. If you are a resale store of luxury goods or furniture, you are absolutely killing it right now. It's one of our highest performing businesses that we've got, and I'll show you an example of that in a bit. They love it because if you think about, in Athens, Georgia, there's a store called Agora, and they sell used Chanel purses and things like that, Louis Vuitton bags. That's real nice. And those items are not being tariffed, and they're used. And the people who are consuming that basically still have that luxury goods addiction that's hanging over from COVID stimulus. That's still there. So people want to spend, and they'll buy those goods, and those people are doing great. And with all of the potential tariffs that could be put on upholstered furniture, stuff like that, furniture stores are doing really well too. So on the used side, not the new side. So anyway, what I'm saying here is the story is really nuanced in tariffs. It goes across the spectrum in many different ways. Now, we did ask the client straight up, how do you feel about tariffs? Just to cut through all of it and see what they thought. And what you have was 44% thought negatively of them, 22% thought positively, and 34% were neutral on this. I am going to be real interested to see how this question and response is in the middle of next year, because you're going to see that 34% go into one of these two camps, and that is going to happen right when we start to hit midterms. So this is going to be a really, really, really interesting scenario to watch. Let's talk about employment. Currently, employment is extremely static. We've got most of our clients who say that they have the same number of headcount now as the previous quarter. And what you can see is that response has been constant for about 18 months now. Now, what I will say is that if you look at the number that said lower and you compare it to the higher, the number that said lower exceeded the number that said higher for 5 of the 6 quarters in the past 6 quarters. And the 6th quarter where it didn't exceed it, it equaled it. So it doesn't take my Georgia Tech analysts to know that jobs are being lost. So when we heard the Bureau of Labor Statistics restatement of the data and President Trump's criticism of the way the data is processed, frankly, I wasn't surprised, and I didn't really disagree with him at all. I think that they do need to look at the data. Now, it wouldn't really give him the answer that he wanted. We weren't surprised that jobs were being lost. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in just a second, but that trend has been in the customer base for quite a while now. Now, when we ask our clients, what does future employment look like? You've got a little bit of a rise in the same, but you still have pretty decent responses for those that are higher in the 22-21% range. But let's think about what we talked about with future business activity in a minute, because future employment does not align with expectations for future business. Remember the chart. 42% were saying that they expect business to be higher in a year, but only 21% of people are saying they're going to raise their headcount. So what does that tell you is going on? It means that people are doing more with less. Well, they've got to do more with less. And why is that happening? Well, there are 2 main reasons. Number one is people can't find the labor that they need. Or more specifically, they can't find the labor that they need at the price that they're willing to pay. That's an important distinction. We've heard this on blue-collar labor since COVID. This has been a constant. But this past quarter was the first time that we heard in the survey that we were seeing this in white-collar labor, specifically in professional trades, CPAs, attorneys, accountants, things like that. I will tell you that on the blue-collar piece, this was interesting to me, down here in Florida, there was a guy that owns a small golf range in a fairly rural area, and he couldn't find 2 people that he needed to run this range, so he purchased what he said in the survey was a golf robot. Now, I don't know what the golf robot looks like. Logan, my analyst over there, we need to email this guy and figure out what the golf robot looks like. But that does show you the degree that people are going to just fill basic labor requirements. We also hear on industries like agriculture, construction, auto repair, and restaurants. That's where we're seeing immigration policy affect those groups, whether it's through actual intervention through immigration authorities or whether it's through fear of joining those workforces. And we're hearing a lot about that in South Florida. That's something that's come, not just Miami, but Tampa, Orlando, things like that. One place where we know that there is no desire to hire anybody would be for inexperienced white-collar labor, and that's mainly the young ones. And once again, I look at my analysts and I apologize to you. But if you ask your kids that are in college, that are coming out in the job market, how things are going for them, They basically, when they're in college, they get an internship. If the internship works out, they get a co-op and they prove to the company that they can work well for them and the company hires them. But if it doesn't go well, it's almost like they got to reset and take a gap year because companies want them proven before they hire them now. That's just the way it is. So a little bit of a pressure on that front. Now the second scenario that we see is that our clients can't afford the labor that we need. And that goes back to the margin pressure. And how are they responding to that? Well, the first thing they're doing is they're cutting down SKUs and services. I think about plenty of restaurants that I've visited over the past year where what I've seen is a menu that offered 10 items and it's gone down to 5. And you've seen the labor source come down a little bit too. And they're trying to lower what they offer to decrease prices as much as they can. We've also seen, and this is troubling to me, but it makes perfect financial sense, we have seen commercial clients look at their customer list and basically triage them for profitability. So let's say I own a commercial air conditioning company and I'm selling to all commercial groups that are construction or whatever, and I look at them and I say, wait a minute, the top 4 are making me the most money and the bottom 4, they're making me money, but it's just a little bit. I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to cut those bottom 4, and I'm going to focus on the top 4, and I'm going to preserve my margin and boost my revenues as much as I can. That makes basic sense. But think about what it does to those 4 that got cut. They're smaller business, they're less profitable, they're probably smaller scale, and what you get is what I call a small business margin spiral, because those clients have to go find a new supplier that's probably more expensive and probably less reliable, and their margin shrinks even further. So that's something that we really have to watch on the small business front. And then we've got automation. That's certainly something that we see take place, specifically in transportation and food services. We're seeing a lot of advancement, but we're also seeing a lot of technology adaptation really related to artificial intelligence. And that takes us to our last bonus question. So we ask our clients, are you using AI? And we had about 70% that said no and 30% that said yes. Now let's dig into that just a little bit. This bottom chart will show impact. We've got minor impact and moderate impact. And what we saw this quarter compared to last quarter is that the number of people that said they were having a minor impact that used AI dropped, and those that said they were having a moderate impact bumped up. So although we don't have a huge number of our clients that are using AI, what we're seeing is that they're migrating from the point where they first get it and they use it to summarize their email or write a country song about their cube mate or whatever, because that's the first thing you do when you get ChatGPT, to actually using it to affect cost and incur savings. And what they're knocking out by doing this mainly would be social media content creation, marketing, advertising, the same kind of things that you cut when your margin gets squeezed the first. That is easily corrected to some degree by AI. It also is being used to address payroll issues, HR issues, which would be related to fundamental employment weakness. AI is quickly replacing these kinds of jobs, and they're hard to quantify because they're mainly gig workers and they're mainly younger workers. Now, what's interesting, I was outside of Atlanta, well, I guess it was in Atlanta, sprawled so much these days, doing this presentation, and a guy came up to me afterwards and he says, look, I'm a social media content creator, and I wanted to tell you how my business is going. And I said, tell me, you doing okay? And he said, yeah, I'm retaining my business. And he said, I'm actually got a little bit healthier profit. And I said, well, how are you doing it? You're the exception. And he said, well, I'll tell you what I did. He said, I told my clients I'd lower their costs to keep doing their social media. And then I started using AI the same way they could have, and I just charged them for it. And I said, well, there you go. And that's the circular relationship of how AI seems to be working now. Now, I'm going to throw Dr. Schroing on the spot here from FSU. There have been some interesting news articles and potential lawsuits that have come out. Think about if you're a college professor and you've got to deal with students who are using AI to produce stuff that may not quite be their work. Well, guess how a lot of teachers are handling those essays and papers? AI. And the students are suing the universities because the teachers aren't given the effort that they want. That's ironic and rich, isn't it? So just indicative of the circular pattern that you do see in AI. All right, so that's the survey piece. Now we're going to get into the big data, and I hate to throw math on people after they've had 2 or 3 drinks and it's about 7 o'clock, but I think that you'll find this interesting. So we call this our cash inflow outflow analysis. And I'll point to this chart. It's got blue and red lines and little red dotted lines. And what we do here is we take all of our commercial deposit accounts and we classify them by NAICS code. That's the North American Industry Classification System. We do it at the 2-digit level, which is over on the right, very, very broad categories. And we do it at the 6-digit level, which are really, really specific categories. And what you do, when you roll those up, we'll do a year-over-year comparison. Fundamentally, it's super, super simple. We're just seeing, did more money come in this year than last year? Did more money go out this year than last year? And the blue line are the inflows, and that's a proxy for revenues. The red line is the outflows, and that's a proxy for expense, or it can be for inflation. And if it's over that little red dotted line, that means it's positive. If it's below it, it's negative. Now, we've got a slightly positive number, but if you look at the tail end of that graph, just what's going on in 24 and 25, what you see is that it's just sitting around that 0 line. This absolutely dovetails with what we hear about business activity. Not much going on, extremely static activity. Now, let's look into some of the sectors that are good and bad, which ones are performing the best, which ones may have a little bit of trouble. And I want to start with the ones that are having a little bit of some performance issues, and I want to start at the top of the supply chain with manufacturing. Now, manufacturing's had some rough inflow hits. They're in the negatives. When you get below 3% on the inflows, that's some legitimate hits. That's at the 2-digit level, which is very broad. But when we dig into the components of this and you ask what's being hit in manufacturing, none of this is going to surprise anybody. Sawmills down 15%, window and door manufacturing down 18%, paving down 16%, plywood down 22%. What do all those correspond to? Single-family residential construction. You're not building any houses, you're not doing any of this. This isn't rocket science. We may look at 25 million data points, but it just kicks out something that generally makes sense. Generally, not always. Now, what's good on this? Anything that are infrastructure components and chemicals, those have done pretty well. Now, a lot of that is subsidized to some degree by the government, but manufacturing is having a little bit of an issue. And when you dig in to manufacturing and you look at the Purchase Managers Index for the specific industry, this is not ours, this is from the Institute of Supply Management, the pattern of how manufacturing is performing shouldn't surprise anybody. This is called a diffusion index, which in my nerd world means that if it's above 50, it's economic expansion. If it's below 50, it's contraction. And what you see is that going back to 21, manufacturing went below 50. When we started raising interest rates. It was too expensive to borrow and invest in this, so people didn't want to do it. Manufacturing went down. Look where it went up. The election. Makes perfect sense. Trump is highly pro-manufacturing, highly onshoring, so people felt really good about that. And when did it go back down? Basically Liberation Day. Once again, not rocket science. That's what we're seeing on the manufacturing front. Transportation and warehousing. So this is having some trouble. And it's because to some degree it is correlated with manufacturing. We look at general freights down 4%. Long distance truckload down 5%, less than long distance truckload 9%. These are all not doing well, and it isn't recovering very well at all across the board. It's really unfortunate. But we see this backed up by some of our metrics from that are nationally, like the Cass Freight Index, which looks at transportation. And when we look at that, you see the inflation in the supply chain that we talked about earlier. When you've got shipments going down 5% and expenses are going up 2%, that's not great when it costs more to ship less, and that's exactly what's going on right now. And when we're headed into an environment where tariffs are pressuring consumption from manufactured goods that are shipped, that's a problem. And what's being shipped? What are you putting on trucks? Sofas, refrigerators, all those things that have some correlation to some degree to single-family residential. Now let's look at retail. Next 44, this is pretty interesting. New car sales are down just a little bit, but they've been way up. And to some degree, that was anticipatory purchases during tariffs, especially with luxury cars. But new cars have done pretty well. What hasn't done well? Used cars. They're down about 17% on their inflows. Our clients are telling us that interest rates have basically killed this because our more cost-conscious consumer can't afford it. I think I heard that the Average price on a new car right now is about $49,000. If you wanted to buy used sedans, let's say you're a single parent household and you bought it with 75,000 miles on it, you may be paying 25, 30 grand at a 10% interest rate. You can't do that and live. That's totally hurting this industry. When you look at the sub-industries in the retail piece, the ones that stand out as doing poorly, floor covering down 12%, appliances down 7%, once again associated with housing. Discretionary categories for what I used to call the big boy toys, like motorcycle and ATV dealers down 5%, boats down 13%, the kinds of things that we bought with stimulus money. Now I want to back up and tell you a little anecdote. I said I used to call them big boy toys. I want to tell you why. So we have a lead analyst in Columbus named Brooke Blackwell, and she's 29, brilliant young woman, been with me for about 7 years. When we do our analysis and we literally sit in an office for about 2 days and go through 800 industries and look at these inflows, she looked at me one time and she goes, I don't like the fact that you call those things big boy toys. And I said, well, why not? And I'll tell you why I did, because in Columbus, Georgia, there used to be a store that sold ATVs and motorbikes, and that's what it was called. And she goes, well, I just bought a golf cart, which made me think, well, maybe I'm paying you a little bit too much. But anyway, she said, I just bought a golf cart, and I don't see that purchase as inherently male. And I said, okay, well, that's pretty fair. And you got to think about, if you knew where Brooke lived, she's in this idyllic neighborhood where all the streets are named after flowers and everybody has their golf carts and their house parties and kids in the street. It looks like, Norman Rockwell, just 2025. And she said, yeah, I think that's just a little bit sexist. And I said, okay, well, let's think about what we can call this. And I said, how about we call it adult toys? And she goes, no, that's much, much worse. Now we just don't call it anything. We just call it RVs and ATVs. But anyway, I digress. Going back into retail trade, one place where we do see considerable strength are things like jewelers, up 6%. Anything aimed at an upper income group is pretty solid right now. They're still spending. We see it repeatedly in the advisory board survey. We were just going over the results a couple of hours ago. It showed up over and over and over again. If you were selling an expensive quality product that catered to that group, I mean, who was it, Logan? It was expensive watches. It was upper end men's clothing boutiques. It was everything that is high is doing fairly well for that group. But what isn't? Discretionary goods like sporting goods down 7%, musical instruments down 12%. Not overly surprising there. Now, I do want to segue into a couple of commercial real estate sectors here, because that is our bread and butter, and plus there's some good stories in Tallahassee that I really want to highlight. So I want to point out some retail statistics, and this is interesting to me. When I look at occupancy rates and rent growth in Tallahassee, the numbers are incredibly strong. 96% occupancy and 2% rent growth, which is pretty decent in this market. When I look at all of these markets that are mainly southeastern markets, 26 out of 32 are better than the U.S. average. Why is that? Because we have such strong in-migration and demographic trends that are coming into this area. Really, really good purchasing power. Now, when we also look at the retail tenants in these shopping centers, we're seeing that they're paying the rent. The collection rates are great. You got over 94% total collections. You've got national tenants high up. You've even got local tenants paying at a 91% rate. This is really good. So you think you got great occupancy, you've got decent rent growth, you've got people paying the bills. That looks good. So why aren't you seeing more retail being built? And what you see here, this is the national pipeline for retail construction. And what we see is that it continues to go down. So what's going on with this? Well, it's a really interesting dynamic. You can't charge high enough rents to justify the construction on retail. So when you see retail being built in a market, it's usually tied to a mixed-use product. Look around. Just stick your head out of any of these windows, you're going to see that exact theory in play. You need a hotel to bring in some demand. You need apartments to have captive demand. That's what's being done. So those are the safest projects. They're also the most expensive, which kind of takes them back out of the safest. So interesting to see what's going on with retail. Let's go look at finance and insurance. Now, these are more of the good segments. Think about what was mainly poor. They were goods and manufacturing. What is mainly good are services. And that's good because when we look at GDP, consumption is about 70% of that. And when we look at consumption, services are about 70% of that. So if services are doing okay, we like it. Guess what inflows are doing the best in finance and insurance? Insurance. That probably ain't going to surprise you if you've looked at your premiums. I certainly know we've changed our insurer over the past year. Especially in this state, huge, huge issues. You see these inflows are way up. Now, the insurance inflows, the fact that they're way up, that isn't profit. It's being paid up to the mothership where it's going to claims. That's just revenues. Where we do see real profits being made are in the finance sector, investment banking up 4%, portfolio management up 8%. What isn't doing well? Consumer lending, specifically with autos and mortgage lending. No surprise there, because it's either expense or demand that's driving that. Now, I've beat up on real estate a lot, but you'll notice that I've only tied that to single family residential when I've been negative. And when you look at real estate overall, it's positive and doing pretty well in some specific sectors. If you can't buy a house, what are you doing? You're renting something. So when you look at the sectors that are doing well, it's residential renting, it's self-storage, because you got to put your stuff somewhere until you get into the house. It's property management, and it's even commercial lending. All of those are positive and super strong. We're even seeing real estate appraisal come back up as we see more deals being done. Now, realtors are still having a tough time. They're down about 5%, can't catch a break. But I think this is a good point to springboard into a discussion on housing. And I want to start with multifamily. Now, you may say, well, why are you showing me these Atlanta statistics? Because Atlanta is the dumpster fire of multifamily in the Southeast. And I want to show you what looks bad so you'll feel a little bit better about what's going on here. Now, Atlanta has had massive supply waves. Last year, they delivered 25,000 units, which was an all-time record. This year, they'll deliver about 20,000 units, which is an all-time record. Thankfully, those will go back down to about half in 26, so we'll see a little bit of evening out. When we look at Tallahassee, obviously nowhere near the numbers, but this bottom chart, this completions of inventory, this is how we determine oversupply. And what it's basically doing is it's charting how much of current inventory is being delivered each year and how that compares to a 25-year average. So you've had some pops over that line that have created some issues where you may have some pressures on occupancy and rents. And you would obviously expect that to be the same thing in Atlanta. And sure enough, if you go to the third quarter of 24 and you look at these stats, you've got Atlanta occupancy was 92% and the rent was minus 4%. Tallahassee occupancy was a little bit better at 93% and rents were at 2.4%. Now, what happens when you deliver a lot of units into those kind of markets? You would expect that occupancy and rent would be hurt. Did that happen? Absolutely not. In Atlanta, you saw occupancy go up 200 basis points. You saw rents go from negative 4% to flat. Tallahassee occupancy went to 94.8% and rents are up to 3.2%. How is that happening when you're seeing huge numbers of deliveries hit all of our southeastern markets? Well, number one would be labor. When you look at Georgia and Florida, Georgia's number 5 in the country for new business creation, and Florida's number 1. So huge demand pieces in labor absorbs multifamily permits. Also, there are rate challenges. Affordability is an issue. When we look at this chart, this goes back to 21 on the back end and current 25 on the front end. The black bars are home sales and the blue line is mortgage rates. Where you see the home sales sort of plummet was right when we started to raise rates, spring quarter of 22. Note when you've seen these black bars pop up. That's right when the interest rate started to hit 6%. And that's vitally important because if we could get those mortgage rates below 6%, we could get them to 5.5 or 5. I think what you'd see is every industry that I've talked about with a low inflow number would correct itself because that's right. I just saw you point your finger in there. That's exactly right. You're going to see that momentum come back into those sectors and the economy would be massively better. And that's why Trump, to some degree, wants those rates brought down by the Fed because he thinks that that is going to pull mortgage rates down. But that doesn't exactly happen. Does anybody know what happened with mortgage rates yesterday after the Fed cut 25 basis points? They went up 25 basis points. Now they came back down 17 basis points today. But the problem is that cutting the Fed rate does not affect the long end of the yield curve very much. And so we're going to have to see what that does. But we really, really, really need to get to 5%. And we'd be really making some hay. The other piece, you can talk about rate, but also the home price is a big one. Although payment is really what drives purchases. Go back to the rate hiking cycle. starter home prices, and I want to focus on this because we're talking about all this occupancy in apartments. These are Class A apartments, and people are going from Class A apartments to starter homes. Now, I do want to point out, the starter home, when I came out of college in 1997, was a 1,000 square foot patio home, and there'd be 100 in a subdivision. That isn't a starter home now. A starter home now holds 2 kids and is about 3,000 square feet, 2,500 square feet. It's a much different product. So the price is higher. But go back to first quarter 22, starter home price was about $313,000, monthly payment $1,400. Most recently, $365,000 with a monthly payment of $2,200. So that's a 17% increase in the home price and a 62% increase in the mortgage price. Now listen, if you're in a Class A apartment, who in the hell would move out and take this trade? No one. And that is paralyzing the market. If you find that person, please tell them to call me, because I have plenty that I can sell them. Now, I'll also tell you that when we're looking at people that could potentially go into the starter home network, and we look at the ages of those people, it's amazing. Average first-time home buyer age, 38 right now. Yeah, 38. Average age of a home buyer, I believe right now, is 54. It just goes to show you who has money and when you get money. And just to show you an example of this, and I'm going to throw Dr. Schroing on the spot once again, we have surveys, we have great relationships with a lot of the academic institutions in our footprint. And Logan is in the master's program for finance here at Florida State, and we're developing a relationship with them. And the doctor here let us conduct a survey where we asked his students at Florida State, essentially, what do you plan to do once you leave college for housing? And one of the questions specifically is, given any expected student or other debt you may have, could you afford to buy an entry-level home when you leave Florida State University? And what was interesting about that was that thousands of people that leave this fine university each year, we only had 6 people that said that they could buy this house. And I was stunned. I just thought that was way low. What's going on with that? So I reached out to him and I asked him, what's going on with this? And he said, well, it's public knowledge. I mean, you can pull this up on the internet and see them. And I kind of said, I don't understand what you're talking about. And he goes, well, here they are. All 6 draft picks can't afford the entry-level home. Now, to be fair, we did not do the survey. He's been a good sport and let me make that joke up tonight. Yes, thank you very much. We do this with all of our academic institutions. I think they probably get together at their school conferences and say, did that nerd make you do this too? I don't know. Anyway, when does this get better? You know, I thought it was going to be better in 25, but we've had such an issue with rate cuts and with different, turbulence in the economy. Maybe you start to get there on the back end of 26, but we need it for sure. Switching back to services, just to kind of get this in the home stretch. Services doing real well. Legal's doing pretty well. We're seeing transactions pick up. I mean, think about the number of private equity deals that you're seeing. We've got veterinary services up 2%. I have a greyhound that I adopted off a Florida track, by the way. She's a little older since they banned. Thank you very much. She's our 3rd. We love those dogs. And took her to the vet. Greyhounds have horrible teeth. She got them cleaned and had 2 pulled. It was $1,500. And I was like, Jesus. I think this 2% inflow is directly related to me. I wasn't quite sure, but that kind of thing really does show you the degree of how these inflows are doing well, how these services are doing well. The bad sectors that aren't doing well won't surprise you. Advertising agencies down 9%, because once again, when your margins get squeezed, what's the first thing you cut, and what are you using AI to eliminate? HR consulting down 4%, payroll services down 2%. Well, that correlates exactly to what we've said about employment demand in general over the past 18 months. If you're not hiring anybody, you don't need these services, and we certainly see that happen. Now, these sectors drive office demand, and that's an issue elsewhere. But before I want to get that, I do want to cover healthcare, because healthcare has performed extremely well. When we talk about the 2 buzzwords that we like in industries, it's health and wealth. We see physicians are up about 4%, assisted living up 4%, skilled nursing up 1%. The senior housing pieces are especially important because they have just cleared where they were before COVID. They have fully recovered. And the metrics look really good, and the demographic patterns are amazingly healthy for future senior housing demand. The trick is who can afford it. And that's going to be a big issue as we go forward, because we're talking about the nice product, and that's expensive stuff. One metric that we watch here on the medical side in social assistance is daycare and child care. Inflows are down 11% here. This is a good bellwether for the lower income group, because the first thing that you do if you have kids in daycare and you're getting pressured on the financial front is you pull them out and you put them at grandma's. So when you see those inflows go down, that's an indicator that that group is getting pressured. And make no mistake, when you hear about the K-shaped recovery, if you don't know what that is, let me tell you, it means one group's going up and one group's going down. We have an extremely bifurcated economy where the wealthy is doing well and the poor are doing horribly. That is only going to be worse, frankly, when you see these benefits expire to some degree. So that's an issue that we watch. It's unfortunate, but hopefully we can rectify some of those situations. Now, going to occupancy in office, and this is something that everybody talks about office as the dumpster fire of commercial real estate. What's interesting, I want to point once again to Atlanta and Tallahassee, because it tells a really illustrative story about what we're seeing in the Southeast. Atlanta occupancy, if you go back to last year, 75%, rent growth 0.5%. You may ask, how's rent growth even positive? They're only counting the leases that were signed. So basically, if you have something that's unsignable, that isn't counting, it wouldn't, it isn't pulling it down. Those are horrible statistics. Tallahassee, excellent numbers, 94%, 2% rent growth. Go to third quarter 25. Atlanta doesn't look great. Rent growth still up a little bit. But Tallahassee still has strong numbers, 94% occupancy, 2% rent growth. And what's really interesting about that is when you dig into this group a little bit more, let's look at the green box. I know it's hard to see these small names, but what we've got up here is a list of markets, with the exception of Miami down at the bottom. Every single one of these markets would qualify as a secondary or tertiary market with some form of strong downtown core, once again, with multiple demand drivers. You certainly got those here. I see it here. I saw it in Pensacola when I was down there a few months ago. I see it in Mobile. I see it in Columbus, Georgia, where I live. I see it in Athens, Georgia. I see it in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. You can tell I'm trying to get to the college towns a little bit, but the point is, these groups are doing extremely well. There's super strong demand. And I think with all of the horrible narrative that we hear about office performance, the truth is that in our footprint, it's extremely dynamic in certain areas. That also falls over to the suburban areas where you've got these live-work cores. That's not dissimilar to what you see in this area. If you've got a larger market, Atlanta looks horrible from a statistic standpoint, but if you find specific areas of Atlanta, they can look very good. And what works? I think this is going back to rent increases. If you want to look at how those rent increases go, you may see rent increases of 10, 15% in some office markets, but it's got to look like a particular product. And I'll show you, this is our new headquarters in Columbus, built in just as we just got in it this year. And over on the left-hand side, you've got this beautiful lounge and open area and nice public spaces. In the middle, those are actually shuffleboard tables and Pac-Man machines. I wonder if HR doesn't have a secret camera installed over those to see who's actually working. You've got a nice atrium that looks over our beautiful Chattahoochee River. I call it Georgia's fabulous West Coast. It's just orange, not white. But these types of properties are the ones that are leasing. We have a Formula One simulator on the top of the building. I've been in places in Atlanta, they don't do this in Columbus, where they've got kegerators on every floor and a golf simulator. That's what's leasing. It's not the older stuff. It all comes down to location and amenities. All right, so we've covered a whole lot of ground today in a whole lot of situations, and I want to try to put a wrap on. I'll tell you something funny. I had a call with the Fed just last week, and they asked me what changes I saw in the economy coming for the first part of 26. And I laughed and I said, why don't you ask your boss? I mean, they're the ones that are going to know. But what I do see, and I think that what we're looking for here is a march to clarity. We've got a little bit more of that on executive actions. I think those are very clear. I think that we are gaining some on tariffs. We got a little bit last night. That picture will continue to develop, but they're isolated pockets that could potentially harm us a good bit. Canada's one that comes to mind. Now, I tell you, Mexico's another one, and I don't know what that lady who's the president of Mexico is doing, but she is the template on how to deal with Trump. He loves them. Canada is right up under his saddle. It's amazing to see the differences in those two places. We do need to see the government open to get a little bit more clarity on the data front. That's something that we need. I think you saw in Powell's comments that he sort of backed up and said future rate cuts aren't a given. And he actually used the verb resume, which implies that you pause. So think about that for a second. I think that may have been sort of a veiled threat to get some more data. I think that we need to get a better read on what the legislative effects are from the big beautiful bill. Those are going to take a little bit longer to manifest and show. When we get that, that'll help. And our gains from trade policy, that's something that unfortunately it takes a long time to build the factory to make the part that guy that has to buy the German part needs. So that's going to take a few years. And do you get to a point to where when this term ends, do they just roll those back? I don't know. But the point is, people just can't sit around and wait on all of this to clear up. So you're going to see some movement coming around in the next couple of quarters. But as far as the trends that I see coming up and basically continuing, upper income is going to outperform clearly, and the service industries are going to outperform, specifically, like I said, health and wealth. But whatever the situation, the Synovus footprint, markets like these that have a strong growth drive and really good momentum are going to continue to do well. Great demographic trends, particularly in Florida. Good vision in communities like these. It's really the external environment that's the wild card. So if we continue to promote the growth that's here with strong vision, locally and on the government front, then I think we've really got something to work with. So thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here, of course, and I'll hand it back to Bill.
Thank you all. I would like to wrap it up and thank Lisa Lassiter, our Business Development Officer, for putting all this together. We appreciate it. This is just some of the expertise that we provide, and I'm going to keep this simple. If you bank with us, send us more business, and if you don't, we'd love to be your banker. The bar will stay open. Please have a drink and socialize, and thank you all for coming in. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, I love that.
If you all
Yeah.